In World War I, we come to the end of the Ottoman Empire. And it was at the end of that war that the Ottoman Empire collapses and ceases to be a political body of the Middle East. So how did World War I change things? First and foremost, World War I brought about the end of the Ottoman Empire that had ruled the Arab countries for 400 years. And from the ruins of the empire, the modern Middle Eastern state system was built. When we discussed the Eastern question in previous lessons, it was noted repeatedly that the European powers sought to preserve the integrity of the Ottoman Empire for the sake of European peace. The fear was that if the Ottoman Empire collapsed and European powers began a competition to take over the empire, they would clash with each other and create a massive European war. But after the outbreak of World War I, the Europeans were at war already. So that logic of maintaining the integrity of the empire was no longer relevant. The Ottoman decision to side with Germany and Austria in the war essentially decided the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The Western powers, Britain and France, and initially the Russians too, had every reason and interest now to seek the empire's defeat and its dismemberment. From an early phase in the war, there were secret talks between the powers about carving up the empire. The Russians wanted the Straits, the Bosphorus, and the Dardanelles. The French wanted Syria, especially the coastal area, and Palestine too. The British wanted Iraq because of the Persian Gulf and India, and a connection from there to the Mediterranean, which created a challenge to the French demands there. In early 1916, a British and a French official, Mark Sykes on the British side and François-Georges Picot on the French side, signed the notorious Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided the Arab parts of the Middle East between Britain and France. France had a free hand in Cilicia, which is in southern Anatolia, coastal Syria and Lebanon, and a sphere of influence stretching eastwards towards Mosul, which is in present-day Iraq. Britain got a free hand in Iraq, including Basra and Baghdad, and a sphere of influence going west all the way to the Mediterranean. In this agreement, Britain also got the ports of Haifa and Acre in Palestine, and much of the rest of Palestine was put under an international administration together with France and with Russian agreement. Russia, however, was overtaken by revolution in 1917 and opted out of the colonial spoils. Along with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, there was a correspondence between the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Henry McMahon, and the leader of the Hashemite family in Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, about the future of the Arab provinces. This correspondence took place in 1915 and served an immediate British interest. Because of her Indian interest, where there were millions of Muslim believers, Britain was very deeply concerned by the Ottoman Sultan's appeal at the beginning of the war to Muslims everywhere to join in jihad against the enemies of the empire. The British were therefore in search of an Arab Muslim ally with whom to fight against the Ottomans, and thus began the connection with the Hashemites. And who were the Hashemites? The Hashemites were this Muslim family of very prestigious lineage. They were descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet Muhammad was himself a member of the House of Hashim. And the leader of the family in the First World War was Hussein ibn Ali, who was the Amir, that is the ruler of Mecca, the Muslim holy city, as the representative of the Ottoman Empire. But even though the ruler of Mecca on behalf of the Ottomans, the Hashemites had their own grievances with the Ottomans and had great aspirations for Arab and Islamic leadership on their own, independent of the Turks. In the summer of 1915, they entered into these negotiations with the British, where the Hashemites demanded a caliphate under Hashemite Arab rule that would rule over the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And the areas that the Hashemites demanded in this correspondence with the British was the entire area stretching, as we can see on the map, from the southern border of Turkey all the way to the Indian Ocean, and from the Mediterranean in the west to the border with Iran in the east. The demands of the Hashemites from the British did not include North Africa. They did not include Egypt either. These, at that time, were not seen as part of the Arab world. They did not see the Arab-speaking peoples of the Maghreb, who were under French colonial rule, as part of the Arab world. And Egypt, under British occupation, was not demanded either. Also because the Egyptians were not seen exactly as part of the Arab nation, and also because the Hashemites were realistic enough not to demand of the British a territory that was under British occupation. So this correspondence, conducted between Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Hussein ibn Ali of the Hashemites. In this correspondence, McMahon agreed, with certain reservations, to the Arab demand. And the question is, why did the British agree? Albeit with various reservations. What did the British want to achieve through this negotiation? The British believed that the Arabs would contribute to the war effort if they rose against the Turks. And if they had a promise of territorial gain, they would indeed rise against the Turks and thus contribute to the war effort against the Ottomans. The British also believed that siding with Arab nationalism would serve Britain's post-war interests in the Middle East, in their competition with the French. That is, if they had the Arabs on their side, it would be much easier for them to exercise British imperial control of the Arab-speaking regions in the Middle East. The Middle East was also important for imperial communications, the passage to India, and oil for the great British fleet were found in the Middle East. And this was critical as an area of communication to the backbone of their imperial power, which was in India.